If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Please be seated. I have a blue 2007 Subaru Outback that has been sitting unmoved in our driveway for more than a year. Sometime in late 2022, I received the news that it needed work, which is never a good thing to hear, and that work far exceeded its value, which is an even worse thing to hear, and far exceeded the amount of our ability to further invest in this vehicle. I think the word that they used is totaled. The blue Subaru came into my life my senior year of high school. It was a gift from my parents to quite literally carry me into the next chapter of life. It did that and so much more. The car was my companion through most of the transitions of my adult life, and it sits there in the background of many of the most meaningful memories that I made in that same time period. It carried me back and forth to college and on countless spontaneous adventures. It drove me and friends, and once me and my sister, across the country on 3 separate occasions, each one opening up new experiences in new places. The vast and open plains of Wyoming, the lush forests of the Pacific Northwest, and the striated bands of color on rocks in the deserts of New Mexico. It moved me from North Carolina to Tennessee to New Haven, Connecticut, and ultimately to New Hampshire. It drove me through mud and rain and sleet and snow. Up until that last move, the move that brought me to New Hampshire, I was able to fit everything that I cared to bring with me in the back of it. I spent countless nights on seats that were folded down, waiting to rise early in the morning to embark on some wild and ill-conceived adventure in the mountains. I filled it with curb discard furniture to help fill a friend's apartment. It's made countless runs to the airport and gotten me home safely after nights with friends that dragged into the early hours of the morning. We've had tense moments, an axle boot that cracked somewhere in South Dakota, a hole that opened up in the exhaust system that drowned out most of the drive back across the country in an ear-splitting roar, expensive repairs that I couldn't remember the names of and could certainly barely afford. But through it all, it's been a companion through a major part of my life. All this is to say, I'm attached to that car. And that's why it's been sitting there for more than a year, and I haven't been able to bring myself to pick up that phone and make a call or make a final decision about what to do with it. In our gospel reading today, Jesus challenges the disciples and those who want to become disciples to consider what it is that they are attached to and what God is calling them to let go of. The reading begins with a conversation between Jesus and the disciples. Peter has just declared that Jesus is the Messiah and spoken that word for the first time in the gospel. Immediately afterwards, Jesus begins teaching them, trying to explain to them what his messiahship will mean. Because Peter and the other disciples have an idea of who the disciple or who the Messiah is. They're envisioning a king, a conqueror who will deliver them from oppression under the Roman Empire. They envision the Messiah as a new David or a new Moses, someone who will lead them to victory over their foes, who will raise up Israel to once again be the greatest among the nations. And so they look to Jesus with that kind of triumphalist hope, as the one who will raise them up. But what Jesus tells them is something much different. The Son of Man will undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. To the disciples, all that sounds ridiculous. It doesn't sound like the Messiah that they thought they had been promised or that they had hoped for. What about the overthrow of the Romans? What about the great victory that would once again lift Israel's status in the world up? And so Peter rebukes Jesus for saying those things. Surely he doesn't mean it. But Jesus' response indicates that he means exactly what he says. Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Jesus, in turn, rebukes Peter for his attachment to his own expectations of who the Messiah would be. Because Peter is attached to this triumphalist vision of who God would send, and by doing so is unable to see and appreciate the reality of the Jesus who is right in front of him. The Jesus who would go on to accept the cross in order to defeat it, who would lose his life in order to save the world's. That theme of attachment shows up again when Jesus turns to the crowds. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. In this call to self-denial, he echoes his words to Peter, as if he's saying, do not worry about your life, your material well-being, social status, your job security, your physical comfort. Do not focus your mind on human things. Because the more that you focus on those things, the more you become attached to them. And the harder it will be to follow God where God calls you. The way of the cross, the way of discipleship requires a willingness to let everything else go. The way of the cross is a way of unattachment, of holding lightly onto the things of this world, knowing that they can be gone in the blink of an eye. The way of the cross is knowing and receiving the love and grace of God, and knowing that it is worth giving everything else up for it. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. Jesus is telling the disciples that the way to a meaningful life, the way to life itself, is not through acquiring and attaching ourselves to the things of this world, but to the Word of God and to the places that it will lead us. I see that blue Subaru every day, and it reminds me of all the things that I'm attached to. Material objects that I've imbued with meaning and significance, that offer a sense of safety, comfort, security, and those less material attachments that offer the same things. Sense of accomplishments, my attitudes, beliefs, perspectives on the world. Like Peter, my expectations of how the future will unfold and where life will lead me becomes its own kind of attachment. Same with my certainties of how the world is and the worldviews that I've created around them. It's easy for me to become attached to my beliefs, my prejudices, my biases, those things that are within me that often go uninvestigated. But I think it is exactly those attachments, the worldview that we create for ourselves, the sort of walls we put up around us to ensure a sense of safety, comfort, security. There's those things, especially, that Jesus calls his disciples to let go of. He calls them to walk the way of the cross that is the way of humility, the way that requires holding lightly to our beliefs, attitudes, and biases, so that by God's grace they may be transformed, to better reflect the will of God and the love that Jesus showed to all who he encountered. That is the work of the gospel and the way of the cross, to make everything else conditional, and to follow Jesus where he leads, along the way of love that God has set out for us. This gospel isn't about self-denial for self-denial's sake, or self-denial for the sake of making ourselves less or miserable. Instead, Jesus asks his followers to give up those things that we are attached to, not so that we can prove our own righteousness or the strength of our resolve. He asks us to give them up so that we may open ourselves more fully to God and to one another, and in the process find ourselves freed from worry and anxiety, from the worries and anxieties that occupy our lives along with them. Those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. The paradox at the heart of our reading today is that the way of the cross, marked by self-denial and suffering, is the way of life. It is only when we are willing to give up those things that we are attached to for the sake of our higher calling, for the sake of Jesus Christ's way of love, that we can gain anything. It is only when we hold lightly onto all we have that we may find ourselves able to open up and receive the abiding peace and contentment that God promises through knowing that our lives are in God's hands. By letting go of the attachments in our lives, the grip that we have on whatever it is that offers an illusion of safety and security, when we let go of those, we free ourselves to live lives of self-giving and loving service. Only when we stop focusing on our own needs for comfort, status, esteem, can we clearly see the needs of those around us and hear God's call to reach out to them in love. The season of Lent is all about letting go of attachments. That's what lies behind the tradition of giving up something for Lent. It's not about a 40-day-long self-improvement project or looking and seeming very pious and contrite. Rather, Lent offers us an opportunity to investigate our attachments, to recognize those things in our lives where we put our value, our esteem, our self-worth, the material objects that we surround ourselves with, and the biases that lie within us. It is only when we recognize those things in our life that we can prepare ourselves to again encounter the cross, to contemplate its mystery, and to receive the gift of Jesus' redeeming love as an example of the path of love that he calls us all to walk on. So in this season of Lent, may we reflect on what it is that we are attached to and what God may be calling us to let go of. May we take up our crosses to follow Jesus and find it to be none other than the way of life. May we loosen our grip on all that stands between us and God and between us and one another. And who knows? Maybe I'll finally make that decision I've been meaning to make for a while. Maybe I'll finally let that blue Subaru go.